Thank you for choosing this seminar. I know it's hard to choose between all the wonderful options. Let me find out who we're talking to here today. Those of you who work in ministry, media ministry of any kind in a local church setting, just raise your hand. Local church setting. Wow, that's like 95% of you. Local church setting. Okay, that's good news. The rest of you, just shout it out. How do you work in which capacity of ministry do you work in? National. Okay. National media. Right? Anyone else? Okay, so local church, national. Any conference? Union? I see a couple. Okay, couple conference, union, division. No. Hospital, healthcare. Anyone? Okay, excellent. So that's good. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to jump right into it because we have a lot to cover, and I hopefully will have time for Q&A. So we're supposed to go till what time? Can anyone let me know? Till 4 p.m. Okay, that's good. Good. So just start writing down your questions, and then we'll go from there. So I think this requires me to give you just a little bit more background about myself, and I'll do that in just a couple of minutes. I am a pastor, but while I was training for sort of the life of a pastor at the undergrad level, I realized that I was also being called to communication ministry. So then, after my wife and I got married, we moved down to Austin, Texas, where I completed a master's degree in radio, television, and film. And from there, I worked both as an associate pastor and as the general manager of a media center owned by the Texas Conference. There, we set up a multicam environment in a local church from scratch. In other words, we purchased the equipment, brought it over, trained volunteers, and so I've been part of setting something like this up in a context in which there was no media ministry there before, not even a fragment, just a PA system essentially. Then, after 4 years of doing that, I was asked by the Loma Linda University Church to function as their pastor for media, which was a first back then, a pastor for media. And those guys had been at media ministry and television ministry for about 30 years before I got there. But when I was invited to come, it was because they needed to take that to a whole different level. And so we're going to talk about some of that as well. If your churches have a media ministry already, how to take that, how to bump it up kind of to the next level. So essentially, with that introduction, I just wanted to let you know that I've worked at various levels of local churches, both, just to give you context, that church in Fort Worth, Texas, where we set up this media center, had about an attending membership of about 350 maybe, between 300 and 400 people. The Loma Linda University Church had around 7,500 members, right, when I was there. And so you can imagine that the scope and the size of what was happening there was bigger. So I've seen the spectrum. I've worked with minuscule budgets that didn't even exist. And then, of course, I've worked with the very, very high corporate level budgets as well, and everything else in between. So I'm going to be sensitive to all of that, and if you have any questions, start jotting them down. You can ask me, I believe, at the end, because we are recording this session, I believe, and it's going to be better to have a Q&A session at the end so that we don't interrupt kind of the stream of recording. Okay, so let's jump right into it. I'm going to tell you what we're going to do today so that you can kind of have a mental mind map for where we're going. We're going to start by talking about equipment. And by the way, I have to apologize because in a seminar like this, I have to assume that there are some of you that are not really that well versed in this area. So in terms of technology and terminology, I may be using some of the terminology that to you is rather fundamental, and I apologize for that. But we're going to start at a place where everyone can feel comfortable saying, yes, I learned about multicam production from the ground up, from A to Z, as it were. So we're going to be talking about some equipment, what makes up a multicam environment. We are in a fantastic room for that because we can point right to some of these items. Then we're going to be talking about a crew, because you can have all the equipment in the world, but if you don't have a philosophy of how you manage the crew, then you're setting yourself up for failure. Next, we're going to go into elements of composition. So now that we've kind of discussed technology and crew, how do you get a great picture, and why do we want to get a great picture? Why does that matter? So that's elements of composition. Then we'll move into directing multiple cameras. There are some elements of directing, especially in a local church setting, especially in a sort of a multifaceted worship service where you have speech, the pastor walking back and forth, you have music, you have drama, you have all sorts of things. We're going to be talking about some of those directing tips. And then we're going to finish off on a more philosophical note, a more conceptual note, but a very, very important one. Is how do you create a multicam culture in your local church? Because in the end, if you don't have the support of the members within that church, and certainly not the support of the pastoral staff, then the media ministry will continue to either sort of plateau for many years, or eventually it will fizzle out and die, and it will not be effective. So our question is going to be, how do we create a multicam culture inside of the church? Just to kind of give you an example for that, at the Loma Linda University Church, we got the congregation to the point where we had the jib, and our jib there was around 30 feet long. What is that, around 10 meters long? And it would literally skim the tops of people's heads. I mean, you can feel the breeze, and even one of your hairs moving here and there. But they were so used to that and so supportive of the fact that their church was a multicam church, was a production-oriented church, that everyone, minus one or two people, were okay with it. In that case, we just say, you know, the jib, that gizmo right there, the jib is over on this side, but look, there's 95% of the rest of the room in here is completely jib-free. So if you would choose another seat, that would be fantastic. But like I said, one or two people. Okay, so let's march into it. And the first thing that we want to talk about is essentially equipment. Equipment. Now, before we jump into any of the pieces of equipment that make up a multicam environment, that make up a multicam setup, we need to talk about infrastructure, right? Infrastructure. You cannot imagine, listen very carefully, and maybe you know this by firsthand experience, you cannot imagine how many churches are built from the ground up or renovated, right? And they do a marvelous job with everything you can see, and they put in all the infrastructure necessary for electrical current to flow through the building, for water to flow through the building, for sewage to flow through the building. Then they say, now we would like to add on top of this new renovation or this new building we've just built, a media ministry. And the first question that we ask them as consultants is, well, do you have the infrastructure necessary to run the wires around the building that are needed in order for this to happen? Blank stares. You can't imagine how many architectural firms, I'm sorry if you work for an architectural firm, but you can't imagine how many architectural firms are completely clueless when it comes to designing buildings for churches in the year 2014 using, thank you, Pastor Villy. Did just one. We're good, thank you. You can't imagine how many build the buildings, design the buildings with zero consideration for media infrastructure. So we must start in a multicam environment by asking the question, if we're going to have 2, 3, 4, 5 cameras around, if we're going to have PowerPoint is dead, Media Shout, right? Or ProPresenter graphics flowing throughout the building because it's do we have the infrastructure to make that happen? Right, so I've been in situations where buildings have not had that infrastructure, and I've myself crawled around through attics just trying to do the best job possible, laying either conduit, PVC conduit to run. It is just a gargantuan task to do that as an afterthought. The best case scenario is to work when your church is being either renovated or being built from scratch. A very good example, a small church in the middle of Texas was building their church from scratch, called us up at the conference office and said, we'd like to do multicam, we'd like to do video. We came down and we gave them a bid, a quote, for what they would need in order to have infrastructure. Of course, they passed out because it was a larger sum than they had ever even thought of. For what? Pipe in the wall? And we said, yes, pipe in the floor, pipe in the wall, pipe in the ceiling, all interconnected, so that when you get the chance to upgrade to what you really want, because they want it to start small, then all of those conduits, all those raceways, all those pathways are ready for you to do what? Just pull a cable through by pulling on the pull string that you left in there, right? The pull string is just a regular string that you tie the cable to, pull it in, and lo and behold, you have cables. The one thing that you don't want to do, by the way, in terms of infrastructure, is to begin to lay stuff on top of the floors and tape it down, right? I mean, I've done that many, many different times just out of sheer necessity. But if there's a way that you can avoid that, then do avoid it. Obviously, you have trip hazards. You have the aesthetic quality of walking into a worship space and seeing all this stuff taped everywhere. So infrastructure is very, very, very important, although it's not very compelling, right? It's like trying to raise money for building a parking lot, right? Or trying to raise money for putting sewage pipes under the church. Nobody really cares, but ladies and gentlemen, it is the most important component of starting a multicam environment. By the way, don't be disappointed if you don't already have the infrastructure. There are ways that you can begin to retrofit by using your crawl spaces and various things, being creative at it to create the infrastructure. Next is the issue of transmission standards. So remember, we haven't even started talking about the components of a multicam system. We're talking here about elements that need to be thought about before you start shopping for a single camera, before you start shopping for a video switcher. What standard will you decide on for your local church in terms of transmission? What we mean by transmission is essentially the type of cable and the type of signal that will flow through that cable, the transmission standards, right? Now, this is challenging because there are so many out there. You start at the most rudimentary level with a transmission standard that is called composite. One signal, let me see if I have any of that. Yes, I do. So here, you can, I'm sorry that it's hard to see, but you can start there at the top. The most rudimentary form of transmission is a composite signal, Most often than not, the composite signal is not a high definition signal, and it is meant many times as kind of a reference signal. In other words, is this thing on or off? Is it producing an image, yes or no, right? The next level up from there, the transmission standard, is a component system, or a component system, right, in which you have three cables and they break up the one signal into RGB, red, green, blue, and then they combine it when they get back to the other side, right? So in this case, the challenge is that you have to use either a very thick cable or three cables to broadcast or to send video over whatever distances you have to send it to. In component, you can actually send either standard definition or, in some cases, high definition component as well. Both of those standards, by the way, that I've just told you about, are going away almost completely, right? You cannot shop for cameras that are standardized on either of those. Now, they may have those as a secondary option, like a camera that has outputs that are either composite or component. For what purpose? For reference purpose. Remember, for reference purpose. In other words, is it on, is it off, that type of a thing. Now, the next standards is where I want to really, really point your attention to. And the reason that we're going over this is it doesn't matter if the camera is on sale from B&H Photo. We in the United States, we use B&H Photo a lot. I'm not sure if they ship overseas, but they're like the kings of anything technology, and they're based out of New York City. Those guys are awesome. So, in other words, it doesn't matter if the camera is on sale or if it's got great specs. If you don't know what your language standard will be, then you're going to start putting together sort of a Tower of Babel situation. You're going to start piecing together in this church all kinds of equipment, and you know what you'll realize at the very, very end is that it's just like a chain. And just like a chain, there is always a weak what? Link in the chain. So you will have purchased all of this equipment because it seemed to make sense, because the marketing guys told you it was exactly what you needed. But in the end, one of those links along the chain didn't speak the same language as the others. And then in the end, it ended being a weak link, which basically has your signal now being less in terms of quality than you had planned for. Okay, so let's go back to those three standards. You have there, number one, and by the way, if you guys have the little clicker that has the laser, that was really helpful, and we could use it up here if it's still laying around back there. Now, so the third one is based on a transmission standard called SDI, Serial Digital Interface. It uses one cable, right? But it allows for uncompressed high-definition video to be sent over long distances, super long distances, right? So in some cases, right, hundreds to perhaps upwards of 1,000 feet of high-definition, uncompressed video over SDI. Thank you, Pastor Philly. So again, right there is where we're talking about HD SDI. SD SDI simply means that either you're doing a standard definition signal over SDI cable or a high definition signal over SDI cable. The next one down from there is called 3G SDI. This is essentially a higher bandwidth, or in other words, a higher quality signal than even HD. And a lot of equipment is starting to show signs of 3G SDI. So if you attend the National Association of Broadcasters, which by the way, if you've never been, I recommend that you attend at least 1 year of the National Association of Broadcasters, always in Las Vegas in April, and always attracting between 100 and 200,000 people. It's absolutely immense. If you're there for all 4 days, you will never, ever see everything. It is an incredible experience. So what you'll see if you walk the floors of the National Association of Broadcasters is you'll see this 3G SDI slowly starting to pop up. I am going to suggest that if you're going to standardize on anything, it would be number one, SDI, not component, not composite, and we're going to be talking about HDMI in just a second. But that you focus in on HD SDI. If you land on HD SDI, you have built yourself a shelf life of several years, 5 to 10 years, I can almost guarantee you, right, with HD SDI. So the reason is, and I'm trying to remember something that I was going to say, and it's escaping my mind right now, but I'm sure it'll come back to me. Oh yes, the reason is that with every equipment purchase that you make, you want to ask yourself the question, are we future-proofing our media ministry? If you're not familiar with the term future-proofing, it means this. When we're purchasing, are we purchasing whatever, whether it's a camera, whether it's a switcher, whether it's a jib, are we setting ourselves up with an upgrade path, with a built-in upgrade path? Or are we purchasing something because it's inexpensive, but it's the thing that's going out right now, and we're not going to have what's coming in right now because we just really didn't have the vision or the resources to purchase that? The best investment that you can make at a local church is to raise a little more in terms of resources and purchase something that is essentially on its way up and is future-proofed for the next 5 years at least. 5 to maybe 6, 7, upwards of even 10 years, if you can do so and if you're working with smaller budgets. So again, I recommend very highly that you begin looking at cameras and various things that offer you SDI and specifically HD SDI. Then we have the last one on the list here. That's called 4K. That's also called Ultra HD in layman's terminology. So if you see these advertisements that talk about Ultra HD, it's 4K. You know what that is? 4 times the resolution of HD. 4 times. Now, you ask yourself the question, how many people can actually watch a signal like that? Very, 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 very few. I mean, there are a couple of monitors on the market, consumer-level monitors, that are 4K monitors. So why are they making 4K cameras? Interestingly enough, they're mostly used in production and film production, so you can shoot a very large scene and crop it later, just like you crop a high-resolution photo in Photoshop, but in this case, you're cropping film, and you're ending up cropping it, since it's 4 times, literally 4 times the frame, right? You're now able to crop a fourth of it and still have it be high definition resolution. So that's where the 4K cameras are really, really fantastic for Hollywood style productions. Okay, so let's move on from here then into the major components. Into the major components, which we start off by talking about switchers. And by the way, before we go there, I promised we talk about HDMI, because a lot of you may find yourself in low-budget situations. You'll go to your local electronics store and you'll purchase cameras that have an output with HDMI, right? HDMI is like the new consumer-level, high-definition way of transmitting signals between, let's say, a Blu-ray DVD player and your flat panel at home. So more and more of these cameras have HDMI built in, so you can take your consumer-level camera home, plug it directly into your TV, and watch whatever you shot right off of the hard drive of the camera. The challenge with HDMI, while it gives you a true high-definition signal, the challenge with HDMI is that you can only feed that signal along a very, very short pathway. We did some experimenting in Texas, and the longest we were able to get an HDMI signal to transmit from a camcorder was 15 feet. 15 feet. So what is that? Around 5 meters, correct? That's it. And the thing with HDMI, it's digital. So it's either on or it's off, right? There's no loss of signal. It's either you have a signal or it's black and you don't have a signal, right? So I would highly recommend doing one of two things. Either steer away from HDMI, or you can purchase from a company called Blackmagic Design. Don't get stuck on the name. They've got great products. They have a little box that you purchase that is an intermediary between HDMI and HDSDI, right? So you purchase that little box from them along with your really inexpensive but great HD camera from your local electronics store, and then you use that interface to take HDMI, 18-inch cable, and then the rest of it runs along SDI, hundreds and hundreds of feet, into where you need it to go. So that's my perspective on HDMI. You just want to be very careful of it when you look into it. Okay, so let's go over the various aspects and the major components. Remember, we're still on equipment of a multicam setup. The first one is the switcher. Obviously the switcher, and remember, I apologize if for some of you this is very rudimentary. The switcher is the piece of equipment that takes all of the signals into it, whether you're talking about cameras or your graphics or a media player that plays video clips, and it takes all of those signals into it and allows you to switch between them and send one or more, when you combine them, right, one or more signals out of a program feed that will either be recorded, that will be webcast, that will be broadcast in a live television sense, and so on and so forth. That's a switcher. So switchers, you can pay a tremendous amount for switchers. Upwards of $200,000 and down, right? All the way down to $300. So, you can get a little cheap little switcher online for. So how do we differentiate between these switchers, and how do we do so quickly so that we can move on? I've given you some options up here, and by the way, if you'd like a copy of this presentation, specifically for the sake of those model numbers up there, just please go ahead and email me. I think my email's on at the very end of this thing. Write it down. If not, I'll be happy to give it to you myself afterwards. But I've given you kind of some options here. The first one starts as a $4,000 option. Now remember, if $4,000 sounds expensive, just think about it. The switcher is the brains of the operation. All the signals go into the switcher, only then to be sort of routed out from there. And again, this is in a less rigorous or less complex multicam environment. If we're talking about a real large-scale multicam environment, then the brains would be what's called a router. But in cases like this, the switcher becomes the router. And remember, what you're doing is you're routing signals in which way you want to go. So the switchers that I'm kind of recommending at this point in time all do HDSDI, because I'm saying standardized along HDSDI, so everything that I'm going to suggest for you does include the option of having an HDSDI signal going out. The first one is this Panasonic, right, at about $4,000. Then the next one is from the same company called Blackmagic, and they have a brand called ATEM, A-T-E-M. And here, this is basically my favorite switcher for low-budget situations, because for under $1,000 US, you can get what's called a rack-mountable switcher. So it's just a very thin little thing that you plug into a rack and you screw it in, that then connects to any old laptop. It doesn't have to be a top-of-the-line laptop at all, and becomes a switcher overnight for under $1,000 US with true HD SDI capability. And the good news is that it takes in as signals both SDI, HD SDI, SD SDI, and even HDMI. So let's just say you were in a position like we are here in this room. This is a perfect example. The two cameras at the back of the room are within 15 feet of what would be the switcher. So in that case, you wouldn't need to buy the intermediary boxes. All you would need to buy are a couple of really high-grade HDMI cables, and you can run from your cameras that have HDMI out right to the switcher, which takes HDMI into it, as well as SD, SDI, right? Then there is the option, if you see there, and it's very hard to read, you have $1,000 and you have $6,000. For another $5,000, at some point in time, you can buy the traditional switcher interface that many of you have seen. The push-button interface that has the fader bar, that you can fade between the different inputs into it. The great news is you don't have to buy it at the same time. You can use your $150 laptop, and when you raise the $5,000, then you can purchase the traditional tabletop switcher and plug it right into it, and it becomes an easier interface for sure. But if you're scaling up your media ministry and building trust and building credibility and building kind of a track record of what you've done for the church, then that's a great way to go. The next one is by a company called NewTek. Right there, it's called the TriCaster. You can start into the TriCaster at around $10,000, but that's because the TriCaster is one of those one in everything box. So it's literally a box that either sits on a tabletop or you can rack mount it as well, that does not only switching, but it offers you an editor. It offers you the ability to webcast right out of the box. It's really a pretty phenomenal product, and they've worked the bugs out over the years. Originally, when this came out about 12, 13 years ago, it was buggy. You'd do one thing, and then you'd bring up another aspect of it, and then the whole thing would crash. So now, 10, 12, 15 years later, this company, NewTek, has almost perfected this product, and is one that I'm comfortable recommending for you today. And again, SD-SDI is available there. And then, of course, you've got some other ones that we won't go into, Broadcast Picks. Then right here, you get into the more expensive ones, Grass Valley, Ross, Sony. Now you're starting to spend $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 on switchers, but these are obviously for much larger venues and for much ministries that have a much broader scope, as it were. But those are kind of the industry leaders that we have there. Let's go to the next one. Cameras. And please, by the way, take notes on your questions, because if you do have questions, we'll answer them later. On cameras, this is where, again, it's important to understand what are we trying to achieve with the camera. Remember, before you look at the price, before you look at the discount, before you listen to your cousin who works at your local electronics store, right, and makes a presentation to the board about what the best way to go is, begin to ask yourself the conceptual, philosophical question, what is it that we want to do with this camera, right? Well, if the camera is always going to be in the same place, in the same room, and we're never going to move it, and we have no plans to do anything else with that camera, then you can begin to shop one way. But if you say to yourself, look, this is really realistically going to be a kind of a multi-purpose use for this camera. We're going to have it put to use in this space, then we're going to take it out of this door in the afternoon, and we're going to shoot a documentary for our local church with it in the afternoon. Then you've got to be thinking in a completely different way, in a completely different way. So what you'll want in that case is you'll want a camera that is both what are called studio configured or configurated for a studio environment like we have here, and what's called an ENG style camera. ENG stands for electronic news gathering, right? The ENG camera, or remember when they had like these huge cameras and the news guys, some still do, you carry them on their shoulder, so you have the nice shoulder mount, and they kind of carry them like that. That would be an ENG style camera that you would need to then take out into the field and produce the documentary. The one consideration that you would need to have in that case is, can I do fancy things with the lens on this camera or not? Because if I'm in this room and my pastoral staff is supportive of ministry but wants the cameras to be flies on the wall in the back room, then you need to have a certain length of lens so that you can actually get a nice, what we call waist shot. We're going to go over this just a little bit later, right? Of the pastor walking. You can have a really great tight shot of somebody on a violin or maybe on an electric guitar, and you want to see the fingering that's happening. You're going to want a lens that can get close enough so you can actually get some great shots with multicam. By the way, if you're not going to be able to do that, don't invest in the multicam. Right? Part of the vision is that you create a sort of an experience for a person at home that mimics a person's experience right here. So let me ask you a question, right? So as I'm playing this guitar, sorry, I'm left-handed, so I'll probably have to flip the guitar to make sense, right? So as I'm doing this, you can actually take your eyes subconsciously and zoom right into my fingers, and you can watch the fingering, right? Not so much when you are only offering these very wide shots with no intimacy to them whatsoever. So you have to ask yourself the question, what type of camera do we need? Okay, well, we need a camera that has a longer lens so that we can zoom in enough to get these things up on stage, right? But we also need a camera that has a lens that we can use for outdoors and maybe not such a long. So then we need a camera that maybe allows for removable lenses, right? The same thing you can do in a DSLR still shot camera, and obviously now sort of a cinema DSLR camera, but on a video camera. Right? So you need to be able to remove your lenses if you want to get really creative with them later on. That's one of the considerations. So let's look at some of the cameras. The other thing, and I'm looking at my notes, and it's reminding me of a major discrepancy. Not discrepancy, but a major sort of decision point, and that is to say, do you have enough resources, and are you able to fundraise to the degree that you can have what are called engineered cameras? Now, this is what separates the pros from the not-so-pros. And I'll tell you why. The concept of an engineered camera is that you have a camera that is connected to a computer, essentially. We call that a CCU, or a camera control unit. And what this little gizmo does is it sits aside all the rest of the little gizmos. So you have, let's say you have a 3 or 4 camera production. You have 3 or 4 of these right in a row. And you have someone who is literally operating joysticks, right, or little knobs, depending on, again, your budget, and looking at a screen to make sure that the cameras all match each other. Because if you don't, you may end up with the cameras seeing different or interpreting the light that goes into them in different ways. In other words, my suit in one camera may be gray, but then in the other one, it might have a kind of a greenish tint to it. And the way to overcome that in a lower budget situation is to just really be fanatic about white balancing, right? In which you take a giant white sheet from home and you string it up like so before the service starts, and all the cameras zoom into the white sheet so all you're seeing is white, and all the cameras push the WB button, the white balance button, and you hold it in for a few seconds, and you're telling the camera that is white. In other words, we're defining what you're seeing as white. Then the camera says, aha, I can then interpret the rest of the colors so that the suit looks the way it does. Now, that is not a guaranteed way to get the cameras that match, but it is a great way if you cannot afford the CCUs. But here's what I'm saying. If you know that you're going to perhaps have the budget to go there, why not purchase cameras that you can later on attach CCUs to? You see what I'm saying? We're future-proofing. We're buying cameras with an upgrade path that you purchase now without the CCUs, and we're pushing the white balance button. But 2 years from now, we've raised enough money to purchase the CCUs, or the camera control units. At that point in time, then we're able to not only match the cameras, but here's the critical thing. You're able to open up the iris of the cameras and close down the iris of the cameras in real time. And what's critical about that is that many times in a worship service, the lighting changes on the stage, whether it's a prayer time and you dim the lights, or whether one part of the stage is not so well lit, and so the pastor comes over here and stands in this area that I can tell right now, because the light isn't really shining on my face, that is not so well lit, and then watch this. I step back into it, or I'm actually quite lit, right? It's very difficult for a professional product to come out of that. And so the CCUs allow what we call the VO, or the video operator, to in real time, again, adjust the iris off. In other words, not for the camera that's on, but for the camera that's waiting to be on, adjust it so that it's perfect, so that when the director says, take camera 3, it looks fantastic. That's why it separates professional environments from the not-so-professional environments, and that's why, if at all possible, you should try to shop for cameras that can be partnered with a CCU. So I've brought just a couple for you that we can go over. The first one is my favorite in the industry right now. It is a camera created by JVC. It does everything that we've talked about. It's a studio camera that you can configure for studio. It does HD SDI. It also shoulder mounts. You can take it right off, and it also allows you to pop the lenses right off and pop a new lens on, just like you do with a DSLR. So there's the model number. It's the GYHM790s. Really all you have to Google is JVC 790, and that's a fantastic camera that you can get into a body and a lens for $10,000 a camera. Now don't panic, because that's a really fantastic professional level camera. Then I also brought a couple of other options by Canon. So Canon makes one for about, and let me read it on my screen here, for about $1,700 US. So now we're talking a little more doable. And once again, it offers you the HD SDI out, and it offers you professional audio inputs, which is a big deal. They're called XLR inputs, so that when you go out into the field and you need to put audio into it, it's professional audio. And then, of course, there's another one. Oh, I'm sorry. The middle one does not have HD SDI. The middle one has HDMI out, so it would have to be partnered with these little boxes, these little intermediaries that you purchase. But the third one, for around $3,000 US, again, a third of the cost of the JVCs, comes with HD SDI built into it. Now, neither of these Canons have CCU ability for that price. However, I believe Canon has worked or may be working on a software interface. So if you can imagine, you create your own CCU by going out and buying an inexpensive laptop, putting the software on it, and it becomes the computer for the camera, right? So those are a couple of choices, and again, the choices in cameras are endless. Let's move on very quickly. The next one is recording. What do you record to? Let me announce here, ladies and gentlemen, that tape is basically dead, right? Tape has died, not an untimely death. We all knew it was going away. And so tape is still around in some contexts, but only as a backup, only as redundancy, right? Only as something that you record to in case the digital recording doesn't happen. So in terms of digital recording, there are some things up there, once again, that I've brought for you. The kind of the industry standard is this one that you see at the very top. It's by a company called Aja, or AJA, depending on how you want to pronounce it, Key Pro, Aja Key Pro. It's around $4,000, but it records a true uncompressed high-definition signal right onto a hard drive that then you can can plug into your editing suite or your editing software and start editing your program immediately, right? So that Jordache Pro you'll see in many, many different environments, both in lower budget and super high budgets. It's very, very standard across the industry. Then there's our favorite company, Blackmagic again. They have one called the HyperDeck Shuttle, right? There you can see for only $350, but you need to partner that with a hard drive that you buy at your local electronics store. Then here's another concept that works if you are really, really low-end budget. You basically record straight to your editing system. Now, by the way, this is not a good way to do this. This is the only way that we have to do this situation. And what I'm talking about here is that you have your edit suite, whether it's Final Cut Pro or whether it's Adobe Premiere. Both of these are nonlinear editing systems or softwares where you edit your program inside of a computer, right? So both of those will take a direct input, audio and video, through your computer from your switched feed in the multicam environment. And you can record straight to the hard drive and then begin to edit right away. The challenge is that computers do what? Crash, right? And they crash, Murphy's Law, at the most inopportune times. And so I would never suggest this as a primary way of ingesting. We call that recording or ingesting. I would suggest it for a redundancy and or an efficiency way of doing it. So in other words, if you're already recording here, record also to your nonlinear editor, because you can begin to edit immediately right from the computer right after you're done. By the way, the other thing that you always want to do is purchase cameras. Obviously, all cameras are going to have a way that you can record right on the camera. So these days, you're going to be recording onto a smaller format medium, like a compact flash card or an SD card or a P2 card that Sony uses, right? Which is way overpriced, by the way. But you're going to be recording to these. What you'll want to do, even when you're switching and you're recording a switched master, is you will always want to what's called ISO, or isolate, the cameras. So what we're talking about here is making sure that you hit record on every single camera, including the switched master. Because number one, what happens if the switcher freezes up? What happens if somebody steps on a cable and all of a sudden the connection comes loose and you miss something on your switcher? You always want to have the feed from all three cameras recording audio, and in this case, it could even be room audio, because all you want is a reference point of where the person is speaking or singing. And then later on, if you need to fix something in post, as we say, you can always do it because you've recorded the image on, or you've recorded the content on the cameras, right? So always isolate the cameras, record on them if you have a chance. All right, so that's basically recording. We move on then to intercom. Intercom is essentially a way in which the people who are on cameras, who are directing, who are running audio in various places, can hear each other talk, ways in which they can communicate back and forth, and that's a very, very important thing to do. I'm only going to give you two recommendations, actually three. One's not written down. One is Telex. The other one is RTS up here. And essentially, you can add a third one called Clearcom, and all three of these are basically industry standard and will allow you to purchase intercom systems at various levels of budgets, right? Telex, RTS, and Clearcom. So a couple of things in terms of intercom. You want to make sure that they are what's called full duplex systems, okay? Full duplex systems. And what that means is that two people can be talking simultaneously to each other, right? Because in the end, you want communication, or communication in a multicam environment is critical, and because of that, you want to be able to talk back and forth with someone at the same time, not to have to wait for somebody to finish before, and that's the full duplex allows for that to happen, back and forth, back and forth. The second thing you want to consider in terms of intercom is that some of these people on your crew will be roaming. So let's say you're in a church environment where you're going to have a floor manager. So a floor manager, for those not familiar with the term, is going to be hanging around on the periphery, and they're going to be reacting and managing the things that happen on stage. They're going to get the talent to sit where they need to be and so on and so forth, and they're talking the entire time or listening to the director. They may even, in many occasions, give the director insights that he needs or she needs, such as, this person is a no-show, they're replacing him with X, right? You need to know this, right? In that case, you can't really have the floor manager on a wired system. So what you'll want to do is shop for a system that offers you both wired stations, right? Or belt packs, as it were, and also wireless belt packs. The good news about any of these companies that they'll offer you a number of different kinds of stations that you can use, whether in the production control room or on a camera or on a roving individual that is walking all over the place. So that's intercom. Let's move very quickly then to audio. Audio is very, very critical, and here's the most critical aspect of it. I think you know that many, many churches that start a media ministry, start a webcast, start a DVD ministry, will simply buy a camera and they will go to the back of their audio board and they will take a second feed from their main output from the audio board and they will go right into either the camera or the switcher or so on and so forth. And what comes out of that is absolute what? Garbage, right? Garbage. Why? Why? Okay, because the size and the acoustical value in this room nowhere near match the size and the acoustical value of your living room, unless you're ultra wealthy and this is your living room, yeah? So always you're going to be dealing with a much smaller space. You're going to be dealing with someone on a tablet, right? You're going to be dealing with someone who is certainly not in the acoustical environment that you're in. So the feed that is right now in this room, mixed for this room, is specific to this room. If you take that same feed and then you feed it to a webcast or a broadcast signal, it will sound horrible because the properties of where we're sending it are different from the properties of the room. So you always want to have two audio mixes. Now, before you get really depressed and say, man, we're doing it that way, but we don't have the budget to buy a second audio board, which is really what you need to do in the end, is to have one audio board for the house and another audio board for broadcast. And by the way, that board needs to either be mixed on headsets if you're in the same room, or you need to have a separate room where the audio operator can have speakers in front of him or her that mimic that non-large room environment that needs to be mixed in a very, very separate way. So the good news is that you can all do this with one board, and some of you, I'm sure, are already doing this. Every single audio board, with, I'm sure, one or two exceptions, have what are called aux buses, AUX. They're auxiliary buttons or auxiliary buses of buttons, and every single fader bar along that board is assigned one of these auxiliary buses. Here's a couple of things you can do with those. Number one, you can assign one of those buses. Many of these boards end up having, let's say, 4 of them, 4 rows of these aux buses. You can say take one of them and assign them to your monitors up here. So as the singer or the speaker says, I need more of myself, you just go up to his channel, raise that aux button, and it comes out only out of these speakers. Same thing with a praise band. You know, I need more guitar, I need more piano out of my speaker. You can just, for these speakers, for these monitors here, take the aux bus and raise and make a special mix right out of there, right? Right out of there. We call that a mouse mix, by the way, right? Because you have the house mix, and then this would be called the monitor mix, because they're monitors, but you combine them and you have the mouse mix, right? That's what they kind of call it. So you can do the same thing with a television feed. Think about it. Then you take the next aux bus and you say, this is our webcast feed right here. And what's going to happen is we're going to have somebody, and this gets a little complicated unless you have one person that can do both, and that requires a lot of skill. But let's say you have a second person here with headsets on who's listening only to what you would be listening on your iPad in your car or at the train station or whatnot, is listening to it on headsets and is basically reaching over and adjusting that aux bus for the broadcast feed. Doesn't cost an extra penny, but it requires two people that hopefully are friends and can live in close proximity to each other and do it off of one board, right? The least case scenario is to have one person doing it, because at some point that person is going to be confused in terms of what's more important, the house or the webcast. The best case scenario, two boards, two different feeds, one for the house, one for the webcast. So, and by the way, the second reason that it is important to have a separate feed is because right now you can hear me out of my microphone, in other words, out of the speakers, but you can also hear me out of my mouth with my vocal cords in this room. The people at home can only hear, right, what the signal that you send them. So that's why sometimes you have, let's say, a praise band, and you're listening to this web feed and it sounds really bad because you can't hear a certain person singing. That's because the person in the house doesn't have to bring that person up terribly, because he or she sings really loud to begin with, right? So you have the natural voice and then the voice from the speakers combining what you hear there. The person at home can only hear what you send them through the microphones. That's why it's critical to have two feeds, always two feeds. All right. I want to give you one board that is very, very, very cool, and that is this company called Presonus, right? It's a board that will allow you to do what I just explained, multiple aux buses, so on and so forth, but this board also allows you to capture up to whatever number of channels it has in multi-tracked recording. Multi-track recording is really critical if you're going to do anything special with music or drama after it actually happens. Multi-track recording actually records every single track to a computer. So again, you attach a simple, cheap, inexpensive laptop to it, and all it's taking is it's recording this audio from, let's say, 20 different channels. And later on, you can edit that audio. So you imagine if you have a dramatic presentation, a skit we used to call them, right? And you have 15 people up here, and at different times they're talking, interacting. Well, this guy or gal up here is having incredible trouble even knowing when the microphones are coming on and off. You turn all the microphones on and you get what? Feedback, right? But you want to really do something with this afterwards. You want to package it, you want to make it available to your congregation. If you multi-track the entire thing, guess what? All those microphones are on all the time, right, to the board. It's just a matter of turning them up to the speaker. So it records everything, and in post-production then, in editing essentially, you can re-edit the whole thing. So that's why this audio situation is critical. Next, and I'm sorry if I'm moving very fast because we have a lot more to cover as well. Next, we're talking about tripods. Now, you may think, oh, we've got a great camera. We're standardized on HD SDI. We've got wonderful lighting, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We have all of these things in place, and you end up with really inexpensive tripods. Now, by the way, this is assuming, going back to our conversation of last night, this is assuming that you're going to actually put traditional cameras on traditional tripods. You can also, by the way, look into robotically operated cameras in situations where the cameras are supported, but they don't want to be seen really. So you can mount these robotic things onto walls and ceilings and so on and so forth. And in that case, those things are pretty sturdy. What you have to look out for there is that it's got a pretty smooth head. So as it moves robotically, you don't have any jitters. You don't have any jitters in it. But for the traditional approach, like we have in this room, where cameras are on tripods, tripods are important because they are the foundation that the camera sits on. They're the foundation that the camera sits on. So imagine you have a great camera, but you've got what's called the fluid head, and the fluid head is the one that actually moves on the tripod as you push left and right, pan left and right. If that isn't a super fluid head, they call it a fluid head, then you start seeing these jitters, right? So you have to buy really good tripods, and you have to buy really good what are called sticks. The sticks are the part of the tripod that are the legs, which are important too, because if you have a heavier camera, then if your sticks or your tripod legs are kind of flimsy. Every time you go to move the camera, it moves the tripod legs just a little bit. And that movement is really, really visible on the television screen, really, really visible. So don't skimp on the tripods. Beware of what you need to purchase. Again, those three right there, I want to share with you, are right now in order of cost. So the Sachtler, or Sackler, depending on how you want to pronounce it, then Miller and Manfrotto are three of the kind of established tripod manufacturers. And you can purchase a Manfrotto tripod for several $100s, right? You can purchase a Miller tripod for a couple of $1,000s, and then the third one, the Sackler, goes up even more from there. But again, a tripod is really not something that I would suggest you purchase online. You want to really get to feel a tripod if at all possible, right? Okay, so moving on from there, then we go into the jib and the lighting. We'll spend just a couple of minutes on the jib. The jib is this gizmo here, and it essentially offers you the ability to move the camera in 3 dimensions, right? In 3 dimensions. Those cameras over there essentially are 2-dimensional cameras. With cameras that are locked on a tripod, you can move along the x-axis and you can move along the y-axis, and that's all you can do. Left, right, up, down. With the jib, you can begin to move along the z-axis, right? You can begin to move back and forth, up and down, left and right at the same time, and it produces amazing, amazing results. As you can see here, they make jibs in smaller versions for smaller rooms like this one, or they make them super, super long, 30, 40 feet, for the larger worship environments. And this is obviously the most invasive form of tripod, the most invasive form of what we call support for a camera, but it makes an enormous difference in the professionalism of your production. So this is where you'll want to work with your congregation. You want to work with your pastoral staff to begin to acclimate a congregation to, if we're going to take this seriously, let's give it a shot, and then let's put a jib in. Then we'll finish off the equipment discussion with tripods. With lighting. Lighting is absolutely critical. In fact, lighting really should have been at the beginning of the list, because you can have the best cameras in the world, but if you have poor lighting, right? If you have poor lighting, the cameras only see what you allow them to see, right? And they are nowhere near as good as the human eye. You and I can walk into almost pitch black environments, allow our eyes to adjust. We're not quite like cats, but we are pretty good at being able to see in very low lux or low light environments. Cameras are not that great. And even though they may be able to see in the environment, the darker it gets, the grainier, right, your camera image gets, because now you have to artificially bump up the lighting with a setting called the GAiN on the camera, and you're pushing up the GAiN, but the more you're pushing up the GAiN, the grainier the image gets, and now you're dealing with a very amateur type of image. So it is ultra important that you have the discussion in your houses of worship about lighting and how the lighting is going to be installed and what the lighting is going to look like, and so on and so forth. And we can have a whole seminar just on lighting, and we certainly don't have the time to do that today, but just make sure that you understand that lighting creates harsh shadows. Harsh shadows if you're not aware of how to install the lighting. The first thing that I want to suggest to you is to always make sure that lighting is set up at 30 to 45 degrees from wherever you want to primarily light an individual or a band or whatnot from. So let's just take, for instance, the pastor in this case. So if the pastor most likely will be kind of walking in this quadrant, what you'll want to do from here is you'll want to calculate 90 degrees, split that in half. I mean, you can do it with a laser thing that you buy at your local hardware store. Or you can just kind of eyeball it to say, okay, this is 90 degrees, about half of that is like right there, and that's where we're going to put our lighting, because that is the best case scenario for a number of different reasons, right? The first one is it doesn't create harsh shadows on a person's face. If you begin to go toward that 30 degrees and then move past the 30-degree mark, you have what are called raccoon eyes. Why? Because most of us have eyebrows, and most of us have kind of a natural outgrowth here over our eyeballs, our sockets, and the light will hit these and then create shadows here, and it doesn't look great at all, right? We call that raccoon eyes. Now, if you take the lighting too far back, what you've now done is you have compromised your backdrop, and that's a challenge. Why? Because many times your backdrop will have its own unique sort of saturation of colors, of lights. And the one thing that you don't want to do, unless you're doing it intentionally, is to basically flood the entire stage, including the back wall, with a ton of light, because then you lose control of what your chancel looks like, or the back of your stage, or your props if you're doing a special program, right? And so this is where it becomes challenging, because even as we see, for instance, in this room, with the lighting angle, we begin to see shadows that are now seen against the back wall. Now you can overcome those shadows in a couple of different ways. You can put more light on the back wall, behind the screen, for instance, and it'll take care of most of the shadow. Or you can begin to move the lights into that magic spot of 30 to 45 degrees where the shadows fall nicely on the floor, right? Fall nicely on the floor and don't compromise the back wall at all. In other words, the light falls behind the person nicely, but not on the back wall. This is why it's also important, by the way, in lighting, to have what are called barn doors, right? These are metal sort of doors, as it were, on the top and on the sides, where you can constrain the beam of the light. And so you can say, well, okay, if we're going to light that back wall with some really cool color LED lights, then what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that none of the what are called key lights, none of the key lights fall on the back wall. We're going to put them at the proper angle. Then we're going to make sure that the barn doors are on so that we don't hit the back wall at all. Now, those really great colored lights are going to make that wall really pop, and your video is going to look absolutely tremendous, right? Okay, so that's the situation with lighting. Like I said, we could literally just have an entire hour and a half just on lighting. Let's move on into a completely different area, and that is more of like a list of very quick technical notes that I want to bring to your attention that we'll go through very, very quickly. It's part of the equipment thing, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Number one, scripts. The concept of scripting out a worship service is critical when you go into a multicam, professional, webcast, broadcast, professional production environment. Why? Because that crew that we're going to be talking about in a little bit must know what's going on. Otherwise, you cannot yell at them after the service for doing a poor job. They have to know what's going on, and they have to be able to plan for what's going on, right? This is where you're going to have a little bit more of a theological discussion amongst yourselves, because the Holy Spirit must be part of that agreement, right? How many times do we say, well, you know, in our church, we just kind of, whatever the Spirit leads us to do, we kind of do, right? That becomes very, very challenging, right? And don't take it the wrong way, but please understand that if you're talking about a professional environment for production, even the most Spirit-filled worship services are planned for, and then they allow the Holy Spirit to move as the Holy Spirit wants to move. But they're still very much planned out with a whole crew of people anticipating the movement of the Holy Spirit. Did you hear what I said? Right? And the second the Spirit moves, in other words, what I mean to say by that is if spontaneously the pastor decides, I'd like to do something because I feel impressed to come up and address the congregation, absolutely that can be done, but there's a whole crew in place that can alert each other instantly to be able to make that happen. But that is, let's say, the 2% of the time. 98% of the time in a worship service, you ought to have a script of what's happening. Who's the person that's going to have the prayer? Where's the pastor going to walk up from? Does the pastor have props in this sermon or not? All of these things are put together in a rundown sheet that allows for certain blocks of time, like 5 minutes for the prayer, so that the crew can have, just like I did for you this afternoon, a mental mind map of where the service is going, who's going to be participating, where they're coming from, so on and so forth. So that is a very important thing. By the way, you don't need a specialized software to do it. In other words, specialized softwares exist. You can look up Planning Center and .com, planningcenter.com. It's a very, very cool option. But you can do this on an Excel spreadsheet. You can do this on an Excel spreadsheet and really, really make it up nice and give it to everyone, and there you have a script. The second one is called live to tape. Live to tape is a situation where even though you're not webcasting, you are pretending that you're going live to the world. And what that does is it puts you on high alert so that you make less mistakes and that you don't say to yourself all the time, oh, don't worry, we'll fix it in post. 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 Then you have so much work to do in post-production that unless you have a large staff to do that, you're overwhelmed already. If you imagine yourself being live all the time, the stakes are higher, your adrenaline stays at a good level, and before long, you've got really fantastic shows that are that are taped, that are sort of live to tape simulated. The next one we've talked about already, ISOing our cameras, where we record what all the cameras are seeing. The next one is called audio follow. Audio follow is where we want to make sure that your audio feed to the webcast and your video feed fade up and fade down at the same time, right? It's not rocket science, but you imagine how many times we kind of miss those cues. So what happens is you first see the video come up and it's silent for about 20 seconds. Then all of a sudden the audio guy just, I got to put this thing up. So all of a sudden the audio comes up and it just makes for a kind of an amateur environment. So the audio follow is, again, if you have an intercom system, you say, okay, we're going live in 3, 2, 1. Let's bring up both audio and video, and everything comes up together. That's called audio follow. Next one is tally. The tally system is, if you look back there, you have a red light on the camera. That tells me that that camera is live to the switcher. So in other words, that's the camera that's going out to the world. Even if you buy the lower end cameras, you can purchase separate tally systems. This is really great for whoever's up on stage, either doing announcements or preaching, that they can actually look into that camera and speak to it as if it was a person, and it really is a person. It represents lots of people, wherever they may be watching from. And the only way the pastor's really going to know where that's happening is if there's a red light on one of the cameras. Makes it easy to address one of the cameras. That's the tally system. The second one is setting focus. By all means, please never have your cameras on autofocus. No matter what level of camera you buy, no matter if it's a consumer brand or whether it's a professional brand, you would never enter even a semi-professional recording or multicam environment and find the cameras on autofocus. Why? Because the cameras aren't smart. They try to be. And they're very helpful. They're loyal to you. And so what they want to do badly is they want to focus. And if you leave it on autofocus, here's what happens. We'll again simulate with a pastor. Imagine you have a pastor that walks a lot, right? So the camera all of a sudden has the pastor right here in the middle. The pastor walks out over here to the edge, and the camera thinks that the pastor has left the scene altogether and now focuses on what? The back wall. Pastor's back in the scene, now the pastor's fuzzy. So the camera on autofocus the entire time is attempting to guess where you want it to focus, the entire time. It's attempting to guess, and they're getting better, by the way, with facial recognition features on some of the consumer level cameras, right? But still, you want to take it off of autofocus, and you want to make sure that you're able to focus manually on what you want to focus and then leave it there the entire time. This is, by the way, also why in a multicam setting with the lower budget cameras, you're going to want to have what are called zoom and focus controls on the arms of the tripod. And in the lowest of budget situations, you buy one little gizmo that has both the focus and the zoom right here at your thumb level. So you can zoom this way, and you can maybe hit a little button that focuses the camera. And all that happens through a little cable called a LANC cable, L-A-N-C, that goes into the camera, and it's already manual for you so that you're not trusting the camera to focus. So please make sure that you set the focus properly and you do it. And by the way, a very quick tip for focusing cameras, you zoom all the way into whatever you want to focus, set the focus, and then zoom back out. Then you know that it's focused. Never focus from a wide shot. Always zoom in first, focus, then pull out, and you know your focus. ISO to screens. What this means is that if you have a ministry in your local church where you're actually showing the video feed on the screens, realize that what people don't want to see is your entire production. They don't want to see the multiple angles. They don't want to see, especially when it comes to like the minister delivering the sermon. They don't want to see the audience shots. You certainly don't want them seeing themselves because, at that point in time, everyone's distracted. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to take one of those cameras and run a separate feed to a screen feed so that when, let's say, the pastor is talking, the entire time there is what's called a waist shot on the pastor as he or she walks back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and that is shown on the screens. That's called an ISO feed to the screens or an isolated feed to the screens. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, your web audience, your television audience, is seeing all the fancy work you're doing with switching all of these multiple cameras back and forth, back and forth. Now, the last one is just a quick tip. When you build tripod platforms, always build the platforms in two pieces, always. Why? Because if you're standing on a tripod and your camera, if you're standing on a platform and the tripod is on the same platform that you're on, no matter how solid that tripod is, if you shift your position a little bit, or if you scratch an itch, right, that's going to be seen. You see the little jitters, like so. Or if somebody decides to come sit on your platform right in the middle of production. So always build two platforms and separate them by 1 inch. Magic didn't cost you an extra cent to do that. You just chopped them in half and made sure the edges were right. And what you do now is you completely isolate. So as an operator now, I'm on the edge of one platform, separated by 1 inch of space. Then there's a platform. If I have to scratch an itch, I take my hands off, scratch the itch, back on. Nobody has ever seen it. It never, ever jiggles, unless somebody sits on that platform, which is another matter altogether. So always build the separation in the tripod. Now let's move on to the crew very, very quickly. What I've done here for you is to kind of outline a skeleton crew and then a full crew and take you through what the different positions are. On the skeleton crew, what you would need is a director. This director sits in front of the switcher and sees all the cameras and then obviously switches between the two of them and makes sure that whatever your intended audience is intended to see, that he or she makes those calls. The engineer or the VO is the one that if you do have camera control units, CCUs, or if you just have a bunch of equipment and you need someone to be able to troubleshoot, you have a person whose job it is to do that. Can you imagine the director? Maybe you can't imagine. The director having to do that, missing, meanwhile, what's happening on stage because they're fiddling with this over here, or they're adjusting the CCU over here. So you always want to have two people, even in a skeletal crew. Then, of course, you have your camera operators and you have that separate audio operator. That's a super skeleton crew. You have a director, you have a technical person that's running around troubleshooting, you have the camera operators, and then you have the audio operator for the broadcast or for the webcast. In a full crew, you have the director that never touches a button. The director sits behind that second individual called the technical director. The director has the job of looking at all those cameras, scrutinizing and saying, okay, let's go with 3, take 3. Number 1, please give me a waist shot of the pastor. Thank you, stand by. Number 1, take 1. Camera 1, take 1. Never touches a button because now their only focus is on the creative aspect of what they see. The technical director sits in front of the director or to the side of the director and is the one who listens to the director and pushes the buttons. Make sure the buttons are working right, make sure that everything is going well. That's the technical director. The engineer is once again the individual that is running around making sure that if there's a technical problem, he or she can engineer it. The next one is the VO that I told you about, the video operator. This is the person operating the camera control units. The tape op, we used to call them tape ops to a degree, they're still called. These are the people in charge of the recording. Why is this important? How many times, I'm hoping this has never happened to you, have you pushed record, right? And then assumed that it was recording for the whole program. You come back and you realize that something happened and it didn't record, right? It recently happened, with one of the sweetest gals ever. We gave her some instructions on how to do something for an interview. She went and she turned on the thing to test it or something of that nature, right? And assumed that it was off. Then when she got ready for the interview, went back, pushed the button again, assuming that she was turning it on to record, only that she was turning it off. Did the whole on-camera interview, didn't record a single thing. right? So in even a medium-sized operation, you need someone whose only job it is to watch that red light. Is it recording? Every couple of seconds. Is it recording? Yes, we're recording, we're doing well. Next one, the A2. The A2 works, it's the audio operator 2, works with the audio operator to have that script. Remember we talked about a script, and the audio operator is worried about the knobs and the buttons and the feedback and everything else, and this A2 is saying, all right, boss, next we've got so on and so forth coming up on the stage. This is requiring 3 microphones. You've got channels 3, 4, 5. You see how this would tremendously help the A1 or the audio operator know what to do without ever having to look at a script. Next, you have the graphics operator. This is the individual that runs either the PowerPoint lyric or the song lyrics or whatever's going up onto your screens or what is being shown at home. The screen director is someone who only worries about these exterior screens. That's their only job, is to make sure what are we sending to these screens and is it what the house needs to see. The floor managers we talked about, these are people that are running around on the periphery, backstage and so on and so forth, making sure that all of these things are happening. The producer is someone then whose job it is to make sure that the entire production is happening A to Z and is there to troubleshoot any issues, whether they be technical or political or logistical. You get the gist, right? The producer is interfacing with the pastoral staff, with the director, with everyone to make sure that everything is moving along slowly. And of course, makeup. You don't ever want to get into a professional situation especially where you have key lights like this and you're not using at least a bit of makeup to make sure that the presenter is looking not so shiny, right? And by the way, you don't need a professional makeup artist. You don't need half an inch of foundation, right? All you need is a good powder. Guys are going to be like, what are you talking about, man? Yes, I have gone into a store and purchased makeup and powder, so yes, I know what this stuff is all about. And what you want to do is now we're going really deep into it. You want to just cover, if you're in a pinch, you want to cover, what is this called, ladies? The T-zone. Thank you. You just want to cover the T-zone. Why? This is where one guy goes, he's looking like, are you kidding me? Do we really have to talk about this? Right? The T-zone, because this is where we shine the most. And so when these lights shine, either our noses are shiny or our foreheads get a little glossy. It's an amazing thing what happens when you put just a little bit of makeup onto a person. It looks very, very professional compared to not doing that. Okay, so there, we've gone through the crew. Let's go through some of the very, very quick things related to crews, rotations, and commitment. I'm a big fan of the 3-week rotation, and I'll tell you why. Because you don't want to burn out your media volunteers. And you also want to give them a chance to worship with their families and so on and so forth. And so I'm a big fan of having 3 crews and recruiting and saying, look, our covenant with you is that unless we have a real emergency, you're only going to be on once every 3 weeks. So you're on 1 week, and for 2 weeks you can worship, you can go to the beach, you can go to the mountains, whatever you want to do, and then you're back on the 3rd. But if you're going to commit to this, we ask that you really, really commit to it. So rotations and then commitment. Commitment to following through on that rotation, and if they're not going to be available, that then they work with you to have a replacement there in place. I can't imagine, I can tell you how much I've witnessed these situations in which 5 minutes before the worship service, you still don't have camera operators, you're recruiting out of the hallways, you're putting people. Why invest financially in a multicam environment and not do the one thing that is absolutely free of charge, and that is to have solid organization of volunteers, so that when your camera ops are on your cameras, they've been trained, they've been there for 10 minutes even before the show started, they've made sure the tripods are good. That requires commitment. Not a single red cent, as we say in the States, but it requires commitment from leadership and commitment from the crew. Then continuity and leadership. This is where you want to make sure that in terms of continuity that you limit the number of directors. So in this case, the best case scenario is that you would have 1 director, but that's unrealistic, right? At Loma Linda, we had 1 director, but that's because this individual had committed as his ministry to that, and his wife was always on crew as well. This is something they did together, right? And they were okay doing that, and that's the best case scenario. Why? Because that every week looks the same. You have the same director that has hundreds of hours of experience, and that program is looking fantastic. In this case, you may have 3 directors, but no more than that. And those 3 directors help swap each other out when there's vacations, because you want to have continuity in terms of how things look. Moving on to the very next one, as I'm watching our time go by very quickly, production schedule and workflow. That's more of the same, where you communicate to the crew, this is what our workflow looks like. This is when we expect you to be here for crew call in the morning. This is when you can leave after the service. The production schedule has basically the next 6 months or maybe the next quarter laid out, so people can put it on their fridge with a magnet and say, okay, I know exactly where I need to be on what weekend. And then a couple of other things. Growth and excellence is a mindset that you teach your crew every single day or every single week. You teach them about growth and excellence. There's always room for growth, and our standard is excellence because we are stewards of the most amazing message on the face of the planet, the gospel message, right? And then the last one is training and certification. In other words, don't assume that people are just going to know what to do. Have a plan where you train them, and best case scenario, where they're like card-carrying media volunteers. They've gone through the training, they know what they're doing, and you're confident that they can do a good job. Okay, let's move on very, very quickly into composition in the last few minutes that we have left. Composition is all about mimicking the human experience in a non-live environment. And what I mean by that is you are sitting in this room right now, and with your eyes and with your 5 senses, you're able to what? You're able to create an experience out of what we do here. So you're able to compose the stage differently. As I'm walking back and forth, you tend to do something naturally with your heads. If you're paying attention, you're going to be going back and forth, right? You're panning back and forth, right? If I put my hand up, your eye goes up. You can do that. The people at home can't. They can't move their TVs up and down and change the composition of the frame. So that's why it's incredibly important to understand something about composition, how to compose the image, how to compose the frame, in this case, mostly in a 16:9 aspect ratio frame. The first thing that's very important is called the rule of thirds, the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds essentially has us taking the frame and breaking it up into thirds this way, right? So a line at this third, a line at this third, and then this way too, a line at this third and this third. And let's focus mostly on the vertical lines because these are super important. Ultimately, what happens is in photography, by the way, the composition concept starts in photography, not in film. So a well-balanced, or should I say a well-composed frame uses what's called the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds says that if you put any of your primary focus on one of these lines, essentially on a third here or on a third there, it creates a more pleasant-looking frame. You go home tonight and you pull out your National Geographic, pull out your Time magazine, and you will see how many photographers follow this rule again and again and again and again. The rule of thirds. There's just something magical and psychological about it. And so in the same way, when you're let's say you're multicamming or you're recording a musician, right? Instead of always having that musician dead center, try to essentially have the musician over off to one side and then having something else in this quadrant over here. It just creates a lot more balance and it creates a lot more interest when we follow what's called the rule of thirds. Balance actually talks about the fact that you don't want to have, let's say, a stage that is completely empty over here and that is completely full of mass over here. Because interesting thing, what will happen is when you go out to the wide shot, subconsciously the whole thing will look like this. And it doesn't set well. Remember, we think many, many subconscious thoughts. And so you just will begin to look at that and say, just something isn't right. You want to flip to the next thing. So you want to make sure that you balance out your stage. If you have a lot of mass over here, then balance it out with some mass over here or remove some from here and put it here. So you want to create a little bit more balance. The third thing that we want to talk about are angles. Angles are very, very important. Now, you see how this crew here is doing it is very, very well done. Why? Because they have all their cameras on one level and they're shooting at the same angle. That is the best case scenario. Now, what you could do is you can, let's say, put a camera up in the balcony and have this really great wide sweeping shot of the whole room. Makes it look like you're at Joel Osteen's church in Houston, Texas, right? That's what happens when you kind of have this balcony cam. But what you don't want ever is to begin mixing the angles of the cameras and creating this situation where, let's say, you do have a speaker and those cameras up there are shooting kind of down the nose of the speaker. These cameras, if they're not done well, but these guys are done really well, are shooting kind of up the nose of the speaker. I've seen a church done exactly like this, and you mix between the two. Can you imagine what that looks like, right? So this is where it becomes extremely important that you work with your church to say, look, you may see the cameras, but boy, let me guarantee you that it's going to be a much more professional product if we have all of our cameras at the same level. If you allow us to put them down here, we'll promise that we'll be tidy and so on and so forth, but we really can't put them up in the balcony at the very corners and begin to call it professional, right? So you don't want to mix angles at all, if you can help it. That's angles. Backgrounds, again, be very, very aware of the fact that you're going to be able to see everything in the background of a person, but many times we're not kind of geared that way, and we're only focused on, well, what can we see up here rather than thinking what's in the background. Are there any strange patterns of the background that are going to stick out of the heads of the speakers, right, artificially, somehow, making them have antlers or horns or that sort of thing? Maybe a flower arrangement that's been put in there, and the pastor stands in front of this flower arrangement and has these like two antlers, growing up out of his head the whole time. You want to make sure that you're aware of the background. And the last one is look for it. Look for the good composition. One of the things that I appreciated about the folks at Loma Linda, even when I came on, they were already used to walking that stage before the program even started. We're talking a couple of hours before it starts. As the setup is happening, they'd say, music director, do you think that we can maybe move this thing just a little bit over here? It would really help. Yeah, sure. Okay, let's give it a shot. Over here, the florist, do you think we can do this over here? They were looking for great composition. And if you watch the Loma Linda University church service right now, it is by far the best produced because of that commitment of that crew to make sure that the composition of their frames were always dead on, and working with the various people to make it happen. By the way, don't get bad attitudes on them and start saying, well, we got to do this for television, Before long, they'll start hating the fact that you're now a media-oriented church. Be tactful, be respectful, but find a way to create good composition on the stage. Okay, moving very, very quickly. Directing multiple cameras. You can see there's a number of different things there that we won't go over, unfortunately, because we're out of time, but I'm more than happy to talk. I'm here basically the whole time, so write some of these down if you know what you need to ask, and go ahead and ask. One of the things that I do want to talk about very quickly is the access rule, which I think is super important, and that is much like in this room right here, which is set up well, very well. That is, your cameras, 1, 2 back there, and the third camera here, are on the same side of the x-axis in this room. What that means is they're on the same side of the room. The reason that's important is because if you have one camera here, one camera here, one camera here, we're going back to kind of mimicking the human consciousness and subconsciousness. If you have one camera on either side and you're doing audience shots and shooting the person talking, what normally happens if you're not paying careful attention is you create a scenario in which the pastor is looking this way. So let's say that I'm facing this way and I'm speaking to this part of the congregation. So obviously I'm facing into this part of the screen. And all of a sudden you jump to an audience shot and you have an audience member who's also looking to that part of the screen. You see how that doesn't make sense? And it doesn't look professional, and immediately in your mind you're going to think something's wrong. So one way to handle that is make sure that all of your cameras are on one side of the axis, and you'll never run into that issue. The other one that I wanted to share with you very quickly in terms of directing and composition is what's called a looking room and walking room. This is extremely, extremely important. So in other words, let's say that you're setting the frame on me as I'm standing this way, and I'm kind of pointing my body in that general direction. So what would happen if you cut off the frame right here and left a whole bunch of room behind me? Where would I, on your screen at home, right? Where would I be looking? Into a virtual what? Wall, right? Right? So I'm essentially this, and I'm looking into a wall rather than panning the camera, leaving very little room back here and giving me a lot of room over here. Now I'm naturally looking into a space. It's the same thing with walking, which I'm sure these guys are doing right now. As I'm walking right now, right, where do I need space to walk into? In the front, right? So in other words, the camera operators need to leave enough room in the front so that I'm not constantly walking into a wall like this, which would seem very odd, right? So that's looking room and walking room, and something to be very much aware of. Okay, and I think that takes us to the last little bit, creating a multicam culture, literally in 30 seconds. I will share with you a couple of things that are super important. Number one, involvement. Involvement. If one or two people are powering this media ministry in your church, and you're doing this blood, sweat, and tears by yourself the entire time, and you have other people complaining, why are we doing this? Why are we spending the money? The quickest way to solve this issue is to involve your critics, or at least to involve the moderate people in your congregation, and the more people you involve, the more they're going to do the job of saying, wow, this is just a tremendous thing. This is just an amazing ministry that is reaching out. And, I just got an email from my cousin. He's watching while he's on vacation, and what a blessing to him as he's able to travel. So involve as many people as possible in the planning for this project, in the implementation of this project. Don't leave it as a pet project of someone or a family or just a small group of people. Don't leave it as a pet project. Second thing is, please focus on aesthetics. Nothing will kill a media ministry in a local church faster than ugly cables everywhere, than cameras that are being left out, and microphones that are laying all over chairs. Focus on the aesthetic. Make sure that it looks tidy and neat, and do that on a regular basis. And then people will say, wow, we hardly notice that the media ministry has sprung up and is growing. We don't notice it because our people are clean. They're clean and they're aesthetically oriented. Then finally, excellence in all things. Again, we talked about that just a little bit. No Band-Aids. I am not a fan of Band-Aids. If somebody says, well, let's just do so. By the way, I learned something at Loma Linda from somebody that had been there for a long, long time. And he said to me, you know what, I've been here for a long time, and I realize that nothing is ever more permanent than temporary. Nothing is ever more permanent than temporary. And so this individual had seen many conversations where they'd say, well, let's just do it temporarily. And all those things were still there many, many, many years later, right? So, and then finally, follow through. If you want to convince your congregation or your pastoral staff that this is a valid ministry, then follow through with your promises, follow through with the covenant that you make with the congregation, follow through with doing the best job at fundraising that you can possibly do, follow through, and little by little you're going to build credibility, you're going to bring the congregation on board, you'll bring your pastoral staff on board, and before long you'll have a thriving ministry. Our time is up, ladies and gentlemen, so thank you so very much, and I am certainly here for you to answer any questions that you may have.